When German armored divisions burst through the Ardennes forest in May 1940, they didn't simply beat the French military. They completely changed how modern combat worked. France collapsed in just 6 weeks, and observers worldwide were stunned as tank formations bypassed the Maginot Line, making it completely useless. The velocity was beyond comprehension. Places that had resisted months-long sieges during World War I surrendered within hours. French soldiers, carrying equipment nearly identical to what their fathers used in 1918, confronted an adversary moving faster than their communication systems could follow. When Panzer IIIs and IVs rolled through rural areas, backed by Stuka dive bombers and motorized infantry, the typical reaction became tragically familiar: disperse, fall back, or give up. The mental damage surpassed the physical destruction. German tanks weren't always better in pure technical terms. French armored vehicles frequently had stronger plating and similar weapons, but the coordinated Blitzkrieg strategy created an impression of unstoppability. Foot soldiers throughout Europe learned a harsh truth: when you detect tank treads, you flee. Anti-tank rifles, standard equipment for most militaries, turned out to be pathetically inadequate against everything except the lightest German machines. The British Expeditionary Force, operating with French troops, witnessed this horror directly. Their Boys anti-tank rifles, weighing 36 pounds and shooting a .55-inch cartridge, could theoretically pierce 21 millimeters of plating at 100 yards. German Panzer IVs, deployed in 1940, featured 30 millimeters of frontal protection. The calculation was devastatingly straightforward. At Dunkirk, from May 26th through June 4th, 1940, the British military pulled off history's largest combat evacuation. They saved 338,226 troops from the shoreline, but abandoned nearly all their substantial gear. Tanks, guns, transport vehicles, everything left behind. The anti-tank weapons that could have given foot soldiers a real opportunity against German armor sat corroding on French ground. Britain suddenly confronted the real threat of invasion, and the defenders had practically nothing that could halt a panzer formation. The German leadership started organizing Operation Sea Lion, believing that once their troops secured a beachhead, British infantry would collapse before their armored spearheads, just as the French had. This wasn't simple propaganda. It reflected observed facts. Throughout the French operation, German tank officers documented that opposing infantry usually panicked and retreated when armor advanced. The rare units that held position were quickly destroyed. The panzers appeared to have an almost magical capacity to materialize wherever defenses were vulnerable, penetrate openings, and trigger chaos far behind front lines. Newsreel film from that era, screened in British cinemas, hammered home the lesson. Tanks dominated the battlefield, and infantry were outdated remnants about to be crushed beneath their treads. German tactical philosophy deliberately fostered this psychological combat. Panzer operators received training to show aggression, to advance even when prudent tactics suggested hesitation, because experience taught them that bold maneuvers frequently caused enemy units to disintegrate without significant combat. Tank leaders like Erwin Rommel had proven in France that a comparatively modest armored unit, boldly deployed, could immobilize and overwhelm a substantially larger traditional force. The legend of invincible armor became reality through belief. Troops anticipated defeat, so they withdrew, which ensured their defeat. British strategists examining intelligence throughout summer 1940 confronted an uncomfortable reality. The Wehrmacht would eventually invade, if not Britain, then elsewhere. And when those panzers advanced, would British soldiers hold firm or break like everyone else? This question troubled the War Office. Developing functional anti-tank armaments became absolutely crucial, but this demanded time, engineering capacity, and answers to challenges no military had adequately addressed. Meanwhile, German armored formations only grew more powerful. The troops rescued from Dunkirk carried back more than fatigue and psychological wounds. They brought tactical information that alarmed British planners. Infantry commanders described witnessing German tanks function with near total freedom, pushing aside defensive positions that should have held. The Boy's anti-tank rifle, Britain's main infantry anti-armor tool, had proven itself a bitter disappointment. Soldiers nicknamed it the elephant gun, though without affection. The weapon's savage kickback fractured collarbones and separated shoulders, while its armor-piercing ability was already outdated. Shooting at an approaching panzer with a Boy's rifle wasn't fighting. It was delayed suicide. Britain's larger anti-tank weapons, the 2-pounder towed artillery, worked adequately when properly emplaced, but shared a critical weakness with all traditional anti-tank guns. They needed transport, preparation time, and predictable positioning. German scout aircraft and forward spotters rapidly learned to locate anti-tank weapon sites, which were subsequently destroyed by bombardment or simply avoided. What British foot soldiers required, what every infantry unit globally desperately needed, was something an individual could transport, something concealable in a hedgerow or structure, something that could emerge from concealment and penetrate German armor before tank crews realized they were targeted. The obstacle was engineering science. To breach tank plating, you needed either an extremely fast round, demanding a powerful gun, meaning weight, or an extremely large explosive payload, requiring a substantial warhead, also meaning weight. Infantry couldn't transport traditional anti-tank weapons. They were simply too heavy, too conspicuous, and too difficult to relocate. Multiple experimental methods had failed. Sticky bombs, explosives mounted on magnetic panels, demanded soldiers approach within arm's reach of a tank, which proved suicidal practically. Anti-tank grenades lacked sufficient explosive force to consistently pierce armor. Molotov cocktails occasionally worked against older vehicles, but were hopelessly insufficient against enhanced German models arriving in 1941. The War Office established requirements that seemed nearly impossible. They wanted something light enough for 1 or 2 soldiers to transport and use, capable of penetrating at least 75 millimeters of armor, sufficient to threaten any current German tank. The functional distance should extend at least 100 yards, providing infantry some separation. It needed to be straightforward enough that conscripts could master it rapidly, dependable enough to operate in mud, precipitation, and freezing conditions, and economical enough to produce by the thousands. And Britain's manufacturing capability was already desperately strained, building aircraft, vessels, and conventional armaments. Whatever they designed couldn't demand rare materials or elaborate machining. Various design groups tackled the challenge through 1940 and 1941. One method used a spigot mortar concept where the projectile mounted over a central rod instead of firing from within a barrel, allowing a much larger warhead relative to launcher dimensions. Another team investigated shaped charge warheads that concentrated explosive energy into a focused stream capable of melting through armor. The Monroe effect, identified decades prior but not extensively utilized, offered a potential answer. A hollow metal cone lined with explosives could penetrate armor substantially thicker than traditional explosives of equivalent weight. The physics involved transforming explosive energy into a supersonic stream of liquefied metal, achieving temperatures exceeding 5,000 degrees Celsius and pressures surpassing 300,000 pounds per square inch. By early 1942, these experimental approaches were merging into one unusual weapon. Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Blacker, a somewhat unconventional ordnance specialist, promoted a design using a massive coiled spring for propulsion. Yes, a spring, like an enormous mechanical catapult. Chemical propellants were scarce, controlled materials demanding careful management and containment. A steel spring could be produced in any metalworking facility, needed no special storage, and couldn't accidentally detonate. The concept sounded ridiculous until you studied the mathematics. A powerful spring, tightly wound and suddenly released, could propel a 3-pound warhead with adequate velocity for combat distances. Testing throughout 1942 showed potential, though potential is perhaps generous. Initial prototypes endangered their operators, were temperamental, and sometimes simply refused to discharge. But they did occasionally punch through armor plate during trials, more than any other portable option could achieve. The projector, infantry, anti-tank, quickly shortened to PIAT, pronounced PIAT, emerged from testing in late 1942, resembling no weapon anyone had encountered. At 32 pounds unloaded, it looked like a metal cylinder with a shoulder support at one end and a trough on top for the bomb. The engineering was genuinely innovative, even if operators came to despise it. Inside that cylinder sat a spring weighing several pounds, compressed with such intensity that cocking the weapon required the operator to lie on their back, plant both feet on the shoulder rest, and pull the cocking lever using their full body strength. A soldier pulling that lever was essentially deadlifting the weapon while simultaneously compressing a spring designed to generate sufficient force to hurl a 3-pound projectile 115 yards. The shaped charge warhead represented the weapon's real brilliance. The bomb itself measured 9 centimeters across, far larger than anything a traditional rifle-caliber weapon could discharge. Inside the warhead's nose cone sat a copper liner, precisely shaped into a cone. When the explosive detonated, the physics became almost elegantly violent. The blast wave crushed the copper cone from the exterior, compressing it into a jet moving at roughly 8,000 meters per second, approximately 25 times the speed of sound. This superheated stream could pierce 75 millimeters of armor plate at a perpendicular angle. Importantly, the penetration didn't rely on the projectile's speed. The PIAT bomb could travel relatively slowly and still breach tank armor, meaning the spring propulsion actually functioned. But the weapon's oddities extended beyond its loading system. Unlike traditional firearms, the PIAT didn't employ a conventional trigger. When discharged, the spring drove a firing pin forward into a shotgun-style primer on the bomb's tail. The bomb launched forward, while the spring and firing assembly recoiled backward inside the cylinder. This recoil automatically recocked the weapon, theoretically. Practically, if the bomb failed to launch correctly, or if the operator didn't brace the weapon adequately, the spring wouldn't compress for the following shot, and the entire agonizing cocking routine had to be repeated. The recoil itself became legendary. Veterans likened it to being kicked by a horse straight in the shoulder. Firing while standing was unwise unless you enjoyed being knocked flat on your back. Manufacturing began seriously in early 1943. British factories produced PIATs by the thousands, while training programs attempted to teach soldiers how to effectively use this peculiar weapon. The training manuals read like warnings. Never fire from an enclosed area. The back blast could be fatal. Never lean the weapon against anything while loaded. It might fire. Always ensure the bomb is completely seated in the trough. A partially loaded bomb could explode instantly. Keep the spring mechanism clean and lightly lubricated, but not excessively oily, or it won't compress correctly. In cold temperatures, the spring loses power. In hot conditions, the lubricants can cause failures. Effective distance is 100 yards, but precision at that range is optimistic at best. For dependable hits, close within 50 yards. For guaranteed penetration, get closer still. The weapon's official designation created some confusion. Calling it a projector rather than a launcher or gun was bureaucratic peculiarity. Perhaps the War Office wanted to avoid comparisons with proper anti-tank artillery. Infantry, meanwhile, developed their own names. Some called it the PIAT bomb thrower. Others used less polite terms after experiencing the shoulder-bruising recoil or wrestling with the cocking system during firefights. But unlike the boys' anti-tank rifle, which troops abandoned whenever possible, the PIAT earned reluctant respect. It was crude, uncomfortable, and challenging, but it functioned. When a PIAT bomb struck a tank properly, the outcome was catastrophic. By mid-1943, PIATs were being distributed to infantry battalions heading for the Mediterranean combat zone. Each weapon arrived with a canvas carrying bag, several bombs, and minimal instruction. The shaped charge warheads were impact-sensitive and required careful handling during movement. The bombs themselves appeared almost absurd. Bulbous heads on stick-like tails, resembling oversized darts rather than proper ammunition. Troops quickly discovered the bombs could be devastating against more than tanks. Fortified positions, concrete bunkers, even buildings could be engaged effectively. The PIAT's flexibility began emerging in combat, though its primary function remained clear: give infantry a fighting chance when German armor showed up. The PIAT received its combat debut in Sicily during Operation Husky, the Allied invasion, starting July 10, 1943. British infantry going ashore carried these unfamiliar weapons with mixed curiosity and doubt. The Sicily campaign offered ideal conditions for testing the PIAT's abilities: narrow roads, stone-walled villages, terraced hillsides where tanks were funneled into predictable paths. German and Italian armored units defending the island soon learned that British infantry no longer simply scattered when tanks approached. In one encounter near Centuripe, a PIAT team positioned in an alleyway disabled a Panzer IV at roughly 40 yards. The shaped charge jet punched through the tank's side plating, and the crew immediately evacuated. German after-action reports began noting something unexpected. British soldiers were actively pursuing their tanks. The Italian mainland campaign that followed provided even more chances. The mountainous landscape of southern Italy, with its narrow valleys and winding roads, favored defenders with portable anti-tank weapons. At Salerno in September 1943, British infantry used PIATs to disrupt several German counterattacks that depended on armored support. The weapon's capability to fire from buildings proved invaluable. A PIAT team on an upper floor could engage tanks from overhead, where armor was typically thinnest. One corporal disabled a Stug 3, pronounced Stug 3, assault gun, by firing straight down onto its engine deck, igniting the vehicle. The German crew, anticipating anti-tank guns positioned at ground level, never considered watching the windows above them. What made the PIAT genuinely dangerous wasn't its technical statistics, it was the tactical versatility it offered. Traditional anti-tank guns needed advanced positioning with clear sight lines, and once they revealed themselves by firing, enemy artillery would target them within minutes. A PIAT team could hide anywhere, wait for the ideal shot, fire once or twice, then vanish into rubble or vegetation before the enemy could react. The weapon transformed infantry from defenseless victims of armored assault into legitimate threats. German tank commanders who'd spent years operating with relative immunity against infantry now had to consider that every hedgerow, every structure, every debris pile might conceal a soldier with a weapon capable of destroying them. The PIAT's shaped charge warhead proved especially effective against the side and rear plating of German tanks. Panzer IVs featured 30 millimeters of side armor, well within the PIAT's penetration ability. Even the heavier Panther tanks arriving in Italy in late 1943 had vulnerable side armor of 40 to 50 millimeters. A well-aimed PIAT shot could disable or destroy any tank in the German inventory if it hit the correct spot. The challenge, naturally, was achieving that shot. Engaging a tank from the front was suicidal. The thickest armor faced forward, and tank crews naturally kept their frontal arc pointed toward probable threats. Successful PIAT teams learned to position themselves where tanks would expose their flanks, at corners, in ambush positions along known routes, or in urban settings where vehicles had to turn frequently. North Africa's desert battles had already concluded by the time PIATs reached theatre, but the lessons learned there influenced PIAT tactics. Infantry anti-tank teams operated in pairs, one man to carry and fire the weapon, another to carry extra bombs and provide security. The firer needed absolute concentration to align a shot, leaving him vulnerable to enemy infantry. The second man watched for threats and could take over if his partner was hit. Ammunition supply became critical. Each PIAT bomb weighed over 3 pounds, and a soldier could realistically carry only 3 or 4 in addition to the weapon itself. Once those were spent, the team was effectively disarmed unless they'd cached additional ammunition nearby. The psychological dynamic between tank crews and infantry began shifting through late 1943 and early 1944. German armored units had to modify their approach. They increased infantry support, employed more reconnaissance, and became far more cautious when operating in terrain that favored ambush. British infantry, conversely, discovered they could stand their ground against armor. Officers reported that men equipped with PIATs showed dramatically less tendency to panic when tanks appeared. The weapon wasn't a survival guarantee, far from it, but it provided agency. Soldiers armed with PIATs weren't helpless, they were dangerous. That psychological shift mattered more than the actual casualty statistics. An infantryman who believes he can fight back will behave very differently than one who believes he's already dead. The PIAT gave British soldiers that belief. When the Allies stormed ashore on June 6, 1944, PIATs accompanied them. The Normandy bocage, that distinctive landscape of small fields enclosed by ancient earthen banks topped with dense hedgerows, became perhaps the weapon's most celebrated testing ground. The terrain was claustrophobic, limiting visibility to 50 or 100 yards in many locations. Roads became natural killing zones, sunken lanes with steep banks on either side where tanks couldn't maneuver off the narrow tracks. For PIAT teams, this landscape was ideal. For German tank commanders, it was a nightmare that worsened with every passing day. The German defenders had positioned their armored reserves, planning to counterattack and drive the invasion back into the sea. SS Panzer divisions, including the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, pronounced Hitlerjugend, and Panzer Lehr, pronounced close to Pair, moved toward the beachhead confidently. These weren't the same hastily trained units that had garrisoned France. These were elite formations with battle-hardened veterans and the latest equipment. Their Panzer IVs had been upgraded with additional armor. Their Panthers were arguably the finest medium tanks in the world. Their Tigers were mobile fortresses. And yet, as these formations engaged British and Canadian forces pushing inland from the beaches, they discovered something unexpected. The infantry wouldn't run. Outside Caen, pronounced Caen, during Operation Charnwood in early July, British infantry battalions defending villages used PIATs to devastating effect. German tank commanders found that advancing down a village street might result in a shaped charge bomb slamming into their flank from a bombed-out building. The Panther's frontal armor could deflect most Allied anti-tank rounds, but its sides remained vulnerable, and the bocage forced tanks to expose their flanks constantly. A Panther would rumble past a hedgerow, and a PIAT team concealed in the undergrowth would fire at point-blank range. The 75mm penetration capability was more than adequate against side armor at 30 yards. Operation Epsom, launched on June 26th, saw some of the heaviest fighting. British infantry advancing toward the Odon River, often said Odon, faced repeated German counterattacks spearheaded by armor. The standard German tactical response, send in the panzers to break up the attack, met unexpected resistance. Infantry companies dug into the hedgerows, engaged German tanks at ranges where pre-war doctrine said infantry should have already fled. One sergeant near Choux, pronounced roughly "Shah," disabled 2 Panzer IVs within 10 minutes, firing from a position in a drainage ditch. The first tank was hit in the track assembly, immobilizing it. As the crew evacuated, the second tank attempted to reverse, exposing its thinner rear armor. The second PIAT bomb penetrated the engine compartment, and the vehicle burned. The Germans tried adapting their approach. They increased infantry screens around their tanks, using foot soldiers to clear suspected PIAT positions before armor moved forward. This worked to an extent, but it dramatically slowed their advance and increased infantry casualties. The Blitzkrieg doctrine that had served them so effectively in 1940 depended on speed and shock. When every hedge might hide an anti-tank team, speed became impossible. Tank commanders who'd been taught to push aggressively forward now found themselves edging cautiously along Norman lanes, anticipating ambush at every turn. The psychological advantage had shifted. German tank crews were now the ones experiencing fear. British after-action reports from July and August 1944 document dozens of successful PIAT engagements. Not every shot resulted in a kill. Shaped charge warheads were sensitive to impact angle, and a glancing blow might fail to penetrate. But even near misses had effect. The sound of a PIAT bomb detonating against a tank's hull was distinctive and terrifying. Crews who survived one hit often abandoned their vehicles after a second, unwilling to wait for a third. The PIAT's psychological impact exceeded its actual lethality. German intelligence officers interrogating captured British soldiers specifically inquired about the infantry anti-tank projector, trying to understand how many the British possessed and where they were deployed. By late July, as Operation Goodwood and then Operation Cobra began the breakout from Normandy, PIAT teams had become a standard element of British infantry tactics. Platoon commanders routinely positioned PIAT operators at key choke points, much as they would position machine gun teams. The weapons were no longer experimental curiosities. They were essential tools. German tactical reports from this period show a marked change in how their armored units approached infantry positions. They used more artillery preparation, more smoke, more caution. The days of panzers rolling confidently through infantry defenses were finished. British soldiers armed with their brutal spring-loaded launchers had proven they could stand and fight. The myth of invincible armor, born in France 4 years earlier, was dying in the Norman hedgerows. Operating a PIAT in combat required a peculiar combination of strength, courage, and desperation. The weapon's mechanics demanded physical exertion that would be exhausting even without people shooting at you. Consider the sequence. You've just fired your first shot, and the spring has, if you're fortunate, automatically recocked. You now need to reload. The bomb weighs just over 3 pounds and must be placed carefully into the trough on top of the weapon, tail fin first, with the primer aligned precisely with where the firing pin will strike. Your hands are shaking from adrenaline. The tank you've just shot at might be disabled, or it might be traversing its turret toward your position. You have perhaps 15 seconds before that tank's machine guns or main gun turn your hiding spot into a death trap. If the weapon failed to recock automatically, a common occurrence, particularly in muddy or cold conditions, the process became genuinely nightmarish. You must physically recock the spring mechanism, which means lying on your back, placing both feet on the shoulder pad, gripping the cocking handle with both hands, and pulling with your entire body strength while straightening your legs. Veterans described this as attempting to leg press roughly 200 pounds while under fire. If you were in a confined space, a building, a trench, a hedgerow, this might be physically impossible. Some soldiers reported taking up to 90 seconds to recock a stubborn PIAT, an eternity when enemy infantry were advancing toward your position. The two-man crew arrangement evolved out of necessity rather than doctrine. One soldier, typically the stronger of the pair, served as the firer. He carried the PIAT itself and 1 or 2 bombs. His partner carried additional ammunition, usually 3 or 4 more bombs in a canvas bag, plus his own rifle and kit. The second man's role extended beyond ammunition bearer. He watched for threats while the firer concentrated on his target. He identified target priorities if multiple vehicles appeared. He could provide covering fire with his rifle if enemy infantry spotted their position. And critically, if the firer was hit, the second man could theoretically take over. Though in practice, operating a PIAT wasn't a skill that could be instantly transferred. Effective range was officially listed as 115 yards, but this was wildly optimistic. The PIAT bomb followed a ballistic arc like a mortar round, not a flat trajectory like a gun. At 100 yards, you were essentially lobbing the bomb toward the target and hoping. Accuracy at that distance was poor enough that training manuals recommended firing only at stationary targets beyond 75 yards. For moving targets, get closer. Most successful engagements occurred between 30 and 50 yards, close enough to ensure a hit, but not so close that the tank's machine guns would certainly kill you before you could fire. 50 yards sounds like a comfortable distance until you are watching several tons of steel and weaponry rumbling toward you at 15 miles per hour. You have perhaps 10 seconds to aim and fire. Your shoulder already aches from the previous shot's recoil. The weapon weighs 32 pounds and must be held steady despite your arms trembling. The shaped charge warhead's effectiveness depended critically on impact angle. Strike the armor at 90 degrees, perpendicular, and the copper jet would penetrate with maximum efficiency. Hit at an oblique angle, and the jet might glance off or fail to penetrate completely. This meant waiting for the perfect shot rather than firing as soon as the target appeared. A tank approaching head-on presented its thickest armor and the worst angle. Wait for it to pass, exposing its side. Better yet, position yourself where the tank must turn, momentarily stopping and presenting a stationary target with vulnerable side armor. This required understanding tank tactics, terrain, and timing. It required nerves that most humans don't naturally possess. The physical toll on PIAT operators was substantial. The recoil caused shoulder bruising that veterans described as resembling severe impacts. After firing 4 or 5 bombs in quick succession, your shoulder might be so badly bruised that lifting the weapon became agonizing. Some soldiers developed techniques to distribute the recoil, firing from prone positions, bracing the weapon against solid objects, but every shot still delivered a punishing blow. The cocking mechanism caused its own injuries. Soldiers reported pulled muscles, strained backs, and in some cases, hernias from repeatedly operating that vicious spring. The weapon demanded you be in peak physical condition, yet it was being operated by men who might not have eaten properly in days, who were exhausted from continuous combat, who carried 60 pounds of kit in addition to the PIAT itself. Yet for all its brutality, the PIAT worked. That's what kept soldiers using it despite the discomfort, despite the danger, despite the physical punishment. When that shaped charge warhead connected properly with a Panzer's side armor, the results justified everything. The jet of superheated copper would punch through steel, and the pressure wave inside the tank would kill or maim the crew, ignite ammunition, rupture fuel tanks. A successful PIAT shot meant one less tank trying to kill you. The village of Villers-Bocage, pronounced Villers-Bocage, on June 13th, 1944, became one of the PIAT's most famous proving grounds, though not in the way anyone expected. The 7th Armored Division, the famed Desert Rats, had pushed forward aggressively, attempting to outflank German positions around Caen. They encountered SS Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann, V.I. Thiemann, in his Tiger I tank, who proceeded to single-handedly destroy roughly 14 British tanks and numerous other vehicles in a matter of minutes. It was a disaster, But amidst the chaos, a single PIAT team managed something remarkable. Sergeant Stan Lockwood, positioned in a building along the main street, fired at Whitman's Tiger from approximately 30 yards. The bomb struck the Tiger's side and detonated, though it failed to penetrate the heavy armor. The impact was sufficient, however, to convince Whitman to withdraw temporarily. That PIAT shot didn't destroy the Tiger, but it demonstrated that even the most fearsome German tank wasn't invulnerable to a determined infantryman with the right weapon. During Operation Epsom, around the village of Granville-sur-Odon, roughly Granville-sur-Odon, on June 27th, Corporal Edward Chapman's PIAT team achieved the sort of engagement that training manuals described, but soldiers rarely experienced. His position, concealed in a destroyed farmhouse, overlooked a junction where German counterattacks had to turn their tanks. A Panzer IV approached the corner, slowed to navigate the turn, and exposed its side armor at approximately 40 yards. Chapman fired, and the shaped charge jet penetrated just below the turret ring. The tank stopped immediately, smoke pouring from the hatches. As the crew evacuated, a second Panzer IV appeared, following the same route. Chapman's loader had already positioned another bomb. The second shot struck the track assembly, immobilizing the vehicle. Chapman's citation for the military medal noted that he'd held his position despite being under sustained, small arms fire, waiting for the exact moment when his targets were most vulnerable. The fighting around Hill 112, that desperately contested piece of ground southwest of Caen, saw PIATs prove their worth repeatedly through late June and early July. The hill changed hands multiple times, with German armored counterattacks attempting to dislodge British infantry, who'd fought their way to the crest. On June 29th, a company of the Duke of Cornwall's light infantry faced a counterattack by Panthers from the 9th SS Panzer Division. The infantrymen, dug into hastily scraped trenches, watched the Panthers approach across open ground. Standard doctrine said they should withdraw. Infantry couldn't hold against Panthers. They didn't withdraw. 3 PIAT teams positioned in mutually supporting positions engaged the Panthers at ranges between 50 and 75 yards. One Panther took a direct hit on its side armor and was knocked out. The other 2 withdrew after near misses, unwilling to continue without infantry support. The company held the hill. Near Caen, during Operation Charnwood on July 8th, Private Arthur Harness found himself in a situation that shouldn't have been survivable. His platoon, occupying shell-damaged houses in the village outskirts, came under attack by 2 Panzer IVs supporting German infantry. The first tank approached down the main street, machine guns raking the buildings. Harness, positioned on the first floor of a stone cottage, waited until the Panzer passed beneath his window. He fired almost straight down onto the tank's engine deck, where armor was thinnest. The shaped charge jet penetrated, and the engine caught fire immediately. The crew evacuated, running past Harness's position. The second Panzer, seeing its companion disabled, reversed rapidly and withdrew. Harness's after-action report noted that he'd been absolutely terrified throughout the engagement, but couldn't think of anything else to do except fire the weapon. These documented engagements share common elements. The PIAT teams achieved success by using terrain, patience, and understanding tank vulnerabilities. They didn't engage from maximum range. They waited for targets to come closer, to expose weak points, to commit to routes they couldn't easily reverse from. They accepted extraordinary personal risk. A PIAT operator firing at a tank from 40 yards was well within range of that tank's weapons. If the shot missed, or if it failed to penetrate, the tank crew now knew exactly where you were. The engagement became binary. You killed the tank, or the tank killed you. There wasn't much middle ground. The kill-to-loss ratio for PIAT teams was never systematically recorded, but anecdotal evidence suggests it was sobering. For every successful engagement, there were teams that died attempting the same thing. caught by machine gun fire while trying to aim, killed by artillery after revealing their positions, crushed when tanks simply drove over their trenches. The weapon gave infantry a chance, not a guarantee, but that chance was more than they'd had in France 4 years earlier. The soldiers using PIATs in Normandy weren't superhuman. They were ordinary men, often conscripts, doing an extraordinarily dangerous job with an unwieldy weapon. What made them remarkable was that they did it at all, that when German armor appeared, they picked up their brutal spring-loaded launchers and fought back instead of running. The PIAT never achieved legendary status in the way some weapons do. It wasn't sleek or elegant. It didn't appear on propaganda posters. Soldiers didn't write home about their affection for it. Yet its impact on armored warfare psychology exceeded what its modest technical specifications might suggest. The weapon's true achievement wasn't the number of tanks it destroyed, though that number was substantial, but rather what it did to the calculus of armored operations. Before the PIAT's widespread deployment, German tank commanders operated with the assumption that infantry posed minimal direct threat to their vehicles. After Normandy, that assumption died. Every building, every hedgerow, every pile of rubble became a potential firing position for a weapon that could kill you. The shift manifested in German tactical doctrine through 1944 and into 1945. Armored units that had previously operated with aggressive independence now required substantial infantry support. Reconnaissance became more thorough, advances more cautious. The pace of armored operations slowed markedly when operating in terrain that favored close-range ambush. This slowdown had strategic implications. The German military's advantage had always rested partly on speed and shock, the ability to concentrate force rapidly and overwhelm defenders before they could react properly. When your tanks must inch forward, carefully checking every potential hiding spot, that advantage evaporates. The PIAT, combined with other Allied anti-tank weapons, transformed armored warfare from a war of movement back towards something resembling the grinding attrition of the First World War. British infantry psychology underwent an equally profound transformation. The men who'd evacuated from Dunkirk in 1940, who'd watched tanks scatter their formations, who'd learned that armor meant defeat, those lessons had to be unlearned. The PIAT provided the tool for that unlearning. When a soldier knows he possesses a weapon capable of destroying the thing that terrifies him, his behavior changes fundamentally. He doesn't panic when he hears tank tracks. He doesn't immediately consider retreat. Instead, he thinks tactically, where's my PIAT team? What's the approach route? Where are the vulnerable angles? This shift from helpless victim to potential threat changed how infantry units functioned. Commanders could position troops in locations that would have been untenable in 1940, knowing that even if enemy armor appeared, the position could be defended. The weapon's influence extended beyond the British Army. American forces observed PIAT operations in Normandy and accelerated development of their own bazooka variants. The shaped charge principle that made the PIAT effective became standard for infantry anti-tank weapons worldwide. Post-war Soviet designs incorporated lessons learned from captured PIATs. The modern rocket-propelled grenade, the anti-tank missile systems that define contemporary infantry anti-armor capability, all trace their conceptual lineage back to weapons like the PIAT that proved infantry could carry effective anti-tank weapons into combat. The PIAT remained in British service until the early 1950s, gradually replaced by more modern designs like the American bazooka and eventually the British Energa anti-tank rifle grenade. By the time it was retired, the PIAT had become almost an anachronism, that peculiar spring-loaded launcher from the desperate years when Britain was improvising solutions to existential threats. Veterans who'd used the weapon in combat had mixed feelings about its retirement: relief certainly, that they'd never have to wrestle with that cocking mechanism again, but also a grudging respect for the unwieldy thing that had given them a fighting chance when fighting chances were in short supply. The statistical record of PIAT effectiveness remains incomplete. British Army records document hundreds of successful engagements, but the chaotic nature of combat meant many actions went unrecorded. A PIAT team that knocked out a tank and was then killed by artillery fire might never appear in official tallies. Conservative estimates suggest PIATs destroyed or disabled several hundred German armored vehicles across all theaters from 1943 to 1945. More importantly, they forced thousands of tanks to withdraw, to take different routes, to operate more cautiously. The tanks that never advanced because a PIAT team might be waiting, those don't appear in any statistics, yet they represent the weapon's truest measure of effectiveness. Perhaps the PIAT's ultimate legacy is what it represented about British military adaptation. In 1940, the army had been humiliated, evacuated, stripped of equipment and confidence. 4 years later, that same army was defeating the Wehrmacht in close-quarters combat and doing it partly through sheer, bloody-minded determination to develop weapons that could level the battlefield. The PIAT wasn't the best anti-tank weapon of the war. The German Panzerfaust was more effective, the American bazooka more reliable. But the PIAT was Britain's answer to a problem that had seemed unsolvable, and it worked well enough when it mattered most. The men who carried it into combat, who endured its bruising recoil and vicious cocking mechanism, who stood their ground when panzers approached, they transformed infantry warfare. They proved that tanks weren't invincible, that infantry wasn't obsolete, that courage and a sufficiently powerful spring could change the outcome of battles. The Germans expected British infantry to run from panzers. Instead, they pulled out PIAT launchers and fought back. That decision, repeated thousands of times across European battlefields, helped win a war.